Northumberland is a rough county. That is its great attraction. Rough are the winds and rough the castles. Rough the moors and rough the miners and rough the stone. And rough the dolerite cliffs by the coast and by the Roman wall.
PEVSNER was right. Northumberland is a rough county, though I don't think we Northumbrians are all that rough, not anymore. And if we once were, well, this is a border county, and life here has been hard. Over on the east, the wind blows off the North Sea across the moors, and up to the north, on the border, the Northumbrians fought against the Scots, on and off for centuries.
It's been a border county since the 2nd century, when the Romans decided to separate the conquered southerners from the barbarians in the north.
And this is their border fence, Hadrian's Wall, built of fine sandstone blocks and stretching 73 miles from Bowness near Carlisle in the west to Wallsend near Newcastle in the east. And in this particular central section, they ran it along the top of volcanic cliffs to give it that extra bit of defensive strength.
The wall was both a fighting platform and a frontier. Every 7 miles was a fort, and every mile a mile castle for about 30 troops, which acted as a controlled gateway.
It was also a way of trapping the enemy. Troops would come charging out of the north gate of the mile castle out into no man's land and surround the attackers and pin them back against the wall.
Above all, it was a symbol of control, a sort of Berlin Wall, meant to frighten off those outside it and cow those inside it. As in Berlin, the same native population existed on both sides of the wall, and the wall was the alien army's way of keeping them apart. If the Roman wall turned Northumberland into a military border, there is a sense in which the county became part of another frontier. In the battle to spread Christianity across England, the landing beach was over on the county's northeast coast.
From the mainland, Holy Island or Lindisfarne is not an impressive sight. The island is flat, and the sands of a laguna separate it from its foreground. Yet one cannot help a feeling of awe as one treads the ground of Holy Island.
There is a feeling of awe here. The flatness of the sands and the vastness of the sky give it a sort of transcendental monotony. But the feeling comes also from the island's extraordinary history as a religious settlement. David Adam came here 9 years ago.
It's the saints of old that have made it special. It began with Aidan in 635 and him founding a little monastery on this island with 12 monks and 12 lads to learn. And they'd have to learn the Psalms off by heart, all 150 of them, and a Gospel off by heart before they did anything else. And these were lads who dedicated themselves like soldiers.
St Cuthbert built himself a hermitage out on these rocks, cut off like the island itself at high tide. In his honour, the community made the Lindisfarne Gospels, illuminated with a Celtic love of pattern, spirals and scrolls, and animals entwined in the text.
Nearly all this country was Celtic before the Anglo-Saxons came. And it's the early Christianity of the island. And because it was early, it was relatively simple. And it didn't have all the layers of building up that we've tended to build up on over the centuries. So the prayers were basic prayers for saying in your home, for saying when you were milking, for saying when you were working, instead of keep coming back to church.
There are few actual remains of Cuthbert's time, but the later bits which do survive seem to illustrate the story just as well. It doesn't seem to matter that this priory was built hundreds of years later by monks of a very different type.
The priory church makes a glorious ruin. The stone is dark red and has weathered into the most curious of vermiculated surfaces. There is enough standing for the buildings to be of both intense architectural interest and eminently picturesque interest against the background of fields and the sea beyond.
I was given my first copy of PEVSNER when I was about 16, and at first I was fascinated but mystified. I spent ages trying to work out what a nookshaft was, or why one window was deck and another one was perp. I know there are people who'd like to kick him for his cool, pedantic precision, but I'm not one of them. He gives you the facts, not just the ball facts, but supported by a towering breadth of vision and experience. So when, for example, he writes about the priory and says, the geometrical motifs between the columns are lively enough to exclude a date earlier than about 1135, you believe him. Not 1150, not 1125, 1135. What a man.
25 years later, I helped revise the Northumberland edition. What an opportunity, but scary, having to match that style. Even worse, having to match that accuracy. The great castle at the other side of the harbour was largely built of stones stolen from the priory. It was built to protect the harbour against attack by the Scots, but they never came, and the castle fell into decay. Lived in. The gaunt ruins of Dunstanburgh on their Dolorite promontory are one of the most moving sights of Northumberland. If you recognise the sonorous tones of PEVSNER there, I quoted them because I agree with them. This place is deeply moving. It was begun in 1314, the year of the Battle of Bannockburn, when the English were trounced by the Scots, and it's built on the most ideal site. In places, the cliffs are so high that it wasn't even necessary to build a wall. But where they were needed, the defences are powerful and dramatic. But the gentler approach from the south is without natural defences, and so has been given a gigantic gatehouse, with a pair of huge drum-shaped towers flanking the entrance. It might seem odd that the entrance should be on the side that's the most easy to attack, from the land, and that the castle is so empty in the middle. But its shape is defined by the landscape. The cliffs define it on three sides, while on the other, the boundary defends the little bay that acted as the castle's harbour. By the late 1500s, the borders had developed a culture of feuding and cattle rustling. The rest of England settled down to a comfy and respectable time, building houses like Longleat or Montacute. So, what were Northumbrians building? This is a basel, Northumberland's unique contribution to English architecture, from the same source as the French word Bastille. The very word sounds aggressive. A basel is a small, defensible building, the ultimate response to life on the violent edge. It's unique because it's a defensible building which combines under one roof accommodation for animals on the ground floor with accommodation for humans up above.
Just look at this extraordinary stonework. The whole wall is built of random boulders, roughly coursed in crude rows. These stones are gargantuan, cyclopean, bonded together with lime plaster, and galleted with little pieces of stone to fill up the spaces. These steps up to the upper doorway weren't added until later. They're not bonded into the original stonework, they sort of lean against it. Until they were built, the only way into the living quarters up here was by a ladder which you had to pull up after you. Just look at the thickness of that wall. That's almost 4 feet thick. And behind the door there's a great drawbar tunnel, deep set into the wall to hold an oak beam so that you could lock the door onto whatever marauders were trying to force their way in. And inside, well, this is it. One room for all of the people who lived here, who would have had to been quite wealthy to build something as solid as this. A couple of tiny windows, because windows were vulnerable. Better to live in the dark. And these are the quarters of the cattle, because they needed their fortress too. Some of these basal byres have got low stone tunnel vaults, but others are like this, with huge transverse close-set oak beams, virtually tree trunks in fact. There are no windows at all, and there's an incredible sense of weight. This is all very oppressive and primitive, and very Northumbrian. At its heart is a genuine medieval priory.
Priory, one of the earliest English foundations of the Carmelites, and among the best preserved priories in England.
But the most remarkable thing about Holm is that the Duke decided to turn it into a pleasure ground, with rooms for hunting banquets and summer picnics. And so inside the walls there's a mixture of genuine medieval remains and pretend Gothic buildings, which in the 1770s and 80s he had his architects, Robert Adam and Capability Brown, scatter among the ruins for him. The mid-18th century didn't have much understanding of genuine Gothic buildings, so it's pretty easy to tell which is genuine and which is Gothic revival. Genuine Gothic arches, worn and steeply pointed. 18th century Gothic ones, smooth, Tudor style. Genuine medieval gateway, plain and severe. 18th century Gothic gatehouse, pretty and light-hearted. Genuine medieval lavatory.
18th century Gothic lavatory, complete with arrow slits to repel boarders.
And Robert Adams' summer house is equally unlike a genuine medieval building. 18th century Gothic revivalists were much less concerned with historical accuracy than with trying to create a style which was rich and decorative. An arrangement like this of a doorway with flanking windows would never have been seen in a genuine medieval building, but it's such a pretty example. Holm was created just when an extraordinary sea change occurred in people's attitude to art and history. The 18th century suddenly seemed to get fed up with the civilised world that it was creating and began to yearn for something wilder. The past, once a desert that nobody cared about, now became something to inspire and intrigue.
The first Duke's father would probably have pulled down his tatty old ruin, but his son allowed himself to be stirred by it. It was a process that went on, of course, all over the country, but Northumbrians seem to have jumped at it with more gusto than most.